I'm Robin Zimmerman, and welcome to the Women's Association of Hilton Head Islands author series for this Thursday, March the 9th, my grandson's 14th birthday. I can't believe it. But we just want to welcome you. It's been a busy day. We had a fabulous health event, Difference Makers. Gina and Eileen put that on at the Hilton Head Library. And now we have our author series with a local author that is just a gem. She lives in Ladies Island. Her name is Rebecca Bruff, and you probably have heard her name. You've read her books. Hopefully you have read or heard about Trouble the Water. That is a book that she's going to be talking about today. It is based on the life of Robert Smalls in the 1800s in Beaufort, South Carolina. She is a treasure. I have talked with her several times on our North of the Broad program in Beaufort for WHHI, and I've just enjoyed getting to know her. She's a wonderful Southern woman that really loves storytelling and loves to write. And actually, I interviewed her in December about a children's book that she wrote. So again, Rebecca Bruff is our featured author for this 28th edition of the author series. And so I just want to remind you, this is a webinar. So you can see us, but we cannot see you. And of course, it takes a team. We have Bobby Helbig, who's our co-lead on the author series, Nancy Fowler, who handles all of the technical components. As you know, Nancy is the executive director of the Sandbox. We appreciate Nancy. And with that, I'm going to bring in my colleague, who is going to actually conduct the interview with Rebecca, and that is Janet Porter. And I just want to remind you that use the Q&A if you have any comments, questions for Rebecca. And again, Janet Porter will conduct the interview with Rebecca. So with that, Janet, you can turn your video on and welcome. It's good to see you. I have been with you all day.
My favorites then. So I am so excited to be introducing you. Hold on one second. I know.
There you go. Okay.
I'm trying to get.
So Janet, I'm going to sign off, not sign off, but I'm going to take my video off, and I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce Rebecca.
Good, thank you. So this is just a reminder that we want you to chat in with questions, and please do that. You can do that from the Q&A, and we'd appreciate it. Nancy Fowler, who does a terrific job of monitoring, will send me the questions, and you'll be able to ask Rebecca questions directly. So I'm so excited to be introducing you to Rebecca Bruff. I know you've heard repeatedly that the most popular genre for our members is historical fiction, but we feel like we really hit the trifecta when we have historical fiction that's local historical fiction. And this is the best local historical fiction we've had in our 28 webinars. So I think you're going to love hearing from Rebecca Bruff. We have not really had books that have focused specifically on the Civil War and and this is the story of Robert Smalls of Beaufort, who was a major hero of the Civil War. This is Rebecca's debut novel. 9 years ago, she visited the Low Country, and she'll tell us more about that. And she's from Texas, and on a carriage tour in Beaufort, she first heard about Robert Smalls and was intrigued. It's so much so that they moved to Beaufort so she could do research for her novel. And I asked her earlier, did they go back to Texas? And she said, no, I'm here permanently. We love Beaufort. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Rebecca. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet. It's great to be with your group.
And where are you right now?
I am on Ladies Island, just across the river from the historic part of Beaufort. Those of you who have visited Beaufort have probably seen the swing bridge, and I can see it from my back window right now.
Yeah,
lovely spot.
And that's not a fake bookcase behind you. That's your real bookcase, right?
That's the real thing. That's the real thing. We like books.
Yeah, I love books too. So tell us we love to hear about your background and how you became a writer and how you really realized I'm a writer.
Oh, goodness. Well, it is a circuitous and kind of a long story, so I'll make it fairly brief. As you mentioned earlier, I am from Texas. I grew up in West Texas in what is called the Panhandle, Amarillo. It's flat and brown and dry. And as a child, as a kid growing up, I loved books. I loved reading, and I loved making up stories and, you know, illustrating and stapling them together and calling it a book. But when I left for college, I had no idea really what I wanted to do. And in the for the sake of efficiency, I was encouraged to take placement tests. And so I did. And so I placed out of what I loved most, which was reading and writing and English and literature and all of those things. So I didn't study any of that as an undergrad. And I finished, finally, I landed on a major and worked in health education for a few years. And then a handful of things, you know, kind of led me down a path toward ministry. I went to seminary when my kids were in grade school and became an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. And did that for quite some time. And that's what I was doing when we visited Beaufort in 2013. And as you said a moment ago, we got on one of the great historical carriage tours and clip-clopped around Beaufort. And I heard for the first time a little bit about this man named Robert Smalls. And so I will tell you what I've only told a few folks along the way. And that is that as the story kind of got under my skin over several years after that visit, I Googled how to write a book, how to write a novel. I really felt like this was a story that needed to be told. And we can talk about why I felt so strongly about that. But it was kind of baptism by fire. I wanted to know how to tell this very important story. So I dove in and figured it out.
It's amazing what we can learn from it.
It is. What I found out as I was exploring how to tell a story, how to write a novel, is that there are so many tremendous resources. Every community has great libraries and community colleges and workshops and writers groups. And I found some of those while I was still in Texas. And I found, of course, a wonderful writing community here in Beaufort through the Pat Conroy Literary Center. And, you know, it does take a village to do some of the work that we do. And this was the product of lots of support and a very steep learning curve.
So take us back to 9 or 10 years ago. Yeah. You and your husband are in Beaufort. I think this was your first trip to the Low Country.
It was my first time to visit the Low Country. Tom had some consulting work here many years before. We were newlyweds at the time. We'd been married less than a year. And the youngest of our 5 children was graduating at Chapel Hill in North Carolina. So we went to graduation, and then we came to Beaufort just for a few days, took the carriage ride. Those of you who have been here will be familiar with some of the things that we saw, but we stopped. The very first stop on that carriage tour was in front of the Tabernacle Baptist Church, downtown Beaufort. And in the courtyard of that church, there's a beautiful bronze bust of a very distinguished looking gentleman. And there's a historical plaque there that tells us that it was Robert Smalls. He was born in 1839. He was born enslaved just a few blocks from that spot where the bust and the plaque are. And he's buried in that courtyard with his family. And we learned in that moment on the carriage tour that he, as I said, had been born enslaved, but he liberated himself and about 15 other enslaved people early in the American Civil War. He was very heroic throughout the rest of the war on behalf of the Union. And then he came back to Beaufort, and he was elected to state legislature and then to 5 terms in the United States Congress. He was responsible for some of the earliest legislation that made public education a real thing in the United States. And I'd never heard the man's name. And that intrigued me. It made me very curious. I kind of got my hackles up that this man's so important. Why have we not heard his name in our textbooks? The carriage tour continued, and we went a few blocks over into the historic Point District. We stopped in front of the house that he was born behind, a beautiful antebellum home on Prince Street. And the tour director told us that he was born behind that home. His mother, a woman named Lydia Polite, gave birth to him alone one night I learned later in my research, she was 45 years old when she gave birth to him alone. She was an extraordinary woman. I learned at that point on the carriage tour that he and his mother and about 65 other enslaved people were owned by the McKee family, Henry McKee family. And that when Robert was about 12 years old, they called it hired out. He was leased to someone in Charleston. And he worked for a little while as a lamplighter. He kind of learned his way around the streets because he was lighting the lamps and cleaning them every night. And then he worked in a restaurant at the Planters Inn, the Planters Hotel. And then he found his way to the wharf, and he was put to work loading ships and tending nets and that sort of thing. And he absolutely loved the water and took to it and learned fast. And soon he was enslaved on a cotton steamer. And when the Civil War began in 1861, right there in Charleston Harbor, that cotton steamer became a Confederate gunboat. And so he and the rest of that enslaved crew were now enslaved on a boat that was keeping them enslaved. So that was in April of 1861. A few months later, November of 1861, President Lincoln sent an enormous fleet of Union soldiers to Port Royal Sound, right where you all are at Hilton Head. And they occupied the Beaufort area. And all of the white population evacuated immediately. In fact, they call it the Great Skedaddle. And the stories say that they left food on the table, they put the silver under the floorboards, and they left town. So the family that was enslaving the Smalls and his mother were part of that evacuation. The next spring, in May of 1862, under the cover of fog one evening, Smalls and his crew had been loading that Confederate arms boat with ammunition, with guns, with cannons, and the Confederate officers left the boat in their charge that evening. They went back into town against orders. And when they came back to the boat late that night, it was gone. And Robert Smalls and his crew had sailed it past every fort in Charleston Harbor. And at the first light of dawn the next morning, they surrendered it to the Union blockade. It became a Union warship. He was serving as a part of the Union Navy at that point, very heroically, and did that through the rest of the war. And when the war was over, he came back to Beaufort. And all those homes that had been evacuated were available for back taxes. And he marched up to the tax office and he paid for the house that he had been born behind. And he raised his family there, lived there for the rest of his life. So I heard bits of that story on that carriage tour in 2013. We flew back to Dallas a few days later, and that man just got under my skin. I started reading and researching and Googling and asking lots and lots of questions. And about 3 years later, determined it was time to try to tell the story. And that's when we moved to Beaufort.
And so then you said to your husband, we need to move to Beaufort so I can write this book.
I said, could we talk about something? and I did. I was working in a wonderful giant Methodist church. There are a lot of giant churches there. And I was loving what I was doing, but the story really was under my skin. And I said to Tom, I feel like I need to either really try to tell the story, really take it seriously, because it's an important story. And the more I learn, the more I realize just how important this man was to all of us. I mean, his story changed lots of lives, including mine and including yours. I mean, he was that instrumental. And so I told Tom that I really felt like I needed to try to do that, or just really try to get it out of my system. And he was an absolute champion. He said, you only go around once, right? Let's do it, And we talked about kind of what sort of risk that might be. And, we weren't going to go down in a sinking ship. It might or might not work, but we had, I'd go back to work. So I arranged for a 4-month sabbatical thinking that we would come to Beaufort for 4 months and I would research and write a book, and learned right away that maybe some people can write a book in 4 months. I was not able to do that. But being here really did give me the chance to do deep research. And it was really important to me to research the history very, very carefully. I love historical fiction. I'm so happy to hear that so many of the readers in your group appreciate historical fiction. I think it's a wonderful way to really learn history. So I wanted to do the research very carefully. But I also wanted to explore the deeper, broader, wider context, all the things that that were part of this grand story. You know, I wanted to think about the economics of the time that were so instrumental in the lead up to the war. I wanted to understand more about the history of slavery and Reconstruction. Those were things that I did not learn very thoroughly in school, even with a lot of degrees. I wanted to think about women's rights at that time. What was it like, you know, and that stage in our history to be a woman? I wanted to explore the influence of faith traditions. And so, you know, really well researched historical fiction gives us a chance to kind of explore all of those things, all the relationships, all the motivations. I wanted to try to either explore or maybe answer some of the questions that were unanswered in my own mind. Why was his last name Smalls? You know, his mother's name was Polite, the owner's name was McKee. Where did he learn to read and write? Where did all that courage come from? So we came to Beaufort. I started going to museums and libraries and talking to everyone I could find, and walking all over town and all over Charleston, and knew that it was going to take more than 4 months to write a book. And by that time, we knew that we loved the Low Country and decided to see if we could figure out a way to make it home.
Oh my gosh, I have so many questions I want to ask you. So first of all, did you go back to being a minister?
So the first year and a half we were here, it was really all about writing the book. And I kind of stayed under the radar in terms of my vocational work. But about a year and a half into it, I was outed along the way. And I served part-time at Carteret Street United Methodist here in Beaufort. And I did that. My husband, Tom, became really ill about 2.5 years ago, and his care required me to be at home. And so I stepped away from the work at the church at that point. But now I'm officially retired, or what is called successfully retired. So I volunteer occasionally and preach now and then. I love to do weddings when I can, and teach and preach on occasion, but I'm no longer on the staff.
Well, that also gives me a perspective, because in the book, you address the perspective of the ministers of the Episcopalian Church, the Methodist Church, that, you know, and so,
Church. Right.
And yes, so you explore their theological perspectives, and I didn't realize that you had a theology background.
Right. I have a doctorate in theology. Master's and doctorate are both in theology. That was really important to me. I knew a little bit about that, but as I dug deeper into the research and found some really wonderful documents from that time frame, it helped me just learn more completely kind of what was going on. And there were other faith traditions as well, but here in Beaufort, the Baptist Church of Beaufort, which is still a lovely, wonderful, functioning congregation, it was led by a man named Richard Fuller, who I portray in the novel. According to his own sermons and according to the research, he was fully in support of slavery, and he based that support on Judeo-Christian scripture. The Methodist, on the other hand, the Northern Abolitionist Methodist, was absolutely opposed to slavery based on those same scriptures. And the Episcopalian rector, Dr. Walker at the Episcopalian Church, who was very beloved and deeply respected, and he really probably baptized and married and buried nearly everyone in the story. He was silent on the issue of slavery. And I felt like that was really important, because then as now, many people, either knowingly or sort of unthinkingly, make a lot of decisions about life, about morals, about economics, based on what we have learned or been taught or absorbed through our faith traditions. And I wanted to really think about that and what that was like for the people in this story.
Yeah, I wonder if an author covering, I know you've talked about the fact that other books have been written by Robert Smalls and I haven't read them, but I wonder if another book who didn't have your author who didn't have your theological background would have addressed that as much as you addressed it. Because and realizing how much it really was of the fabric of the community in that era.
Deep, and even now, I think that those kinds of things are really woven in to our the fabric of our decision making and our timing. So yeah, there are some other wonderful books. There's some great biographies, 2 or 3 really good biographies. There's a wonderful, very scholarly account of his legislative life, but they don't explore those kinds of things in the same way, and that was important to me.
Right. So I want to read a review. One of the things what a reviewer wrote in her brilliant new novel. Rebecca Dwight Bruff skillfully uncovers an American Odyssey, long lost in the camouflage of history. It is an unlikely journey of Robert Smalls, born a slave in Beaufort, South Carolina. While suffering the heartache and horrid indignities of slavery, Small dreams of freedom for himself and his family. In what has to be one of the most daring and nail-biting escapes ever attempted, Small succeeds in changing the lives of many while becoming a Civil War hero and a paragon of civic leadership. It is a testimony to hope through the darkest of times and a testimony to the triumph of the human spirit, not soon to be forgotten. What a wonderful quote. Did you intend for the book to be inspirational when you started, or were you just wanting to cover the history of his life?
I really wanted to tell his story. I wanted people to be aware of this man and his extraordinary life and legacy and the contributions that he's made that still impact all of us. I found myself inspired the deeper I got into it. And so I didn't really see it as an inspirational book, but he has inspired me and continues to. I did not anticipate that his story would sort of kind of give me a opportunity and a platform to talk about our current racial relations and how the past affects the present, and how understanding how the past affects the present helps us move toward the future. There have been some hard conversations. There have been some really enlightening conversations. And he does continue to inspire me, very, very much so.
So let's talk about, there are some books written, but your book has really, I think, made him better known, has made him,
I hope so.
What a phenomenal individual he was in the history, not just of the Low Country, but of the United States. So talk about your research process. Where were you getting this research done? Was it on the internet? Was it at the Historical Society? Talk us about that.
All of the above. It was everywhere. When I first heard the story and we went back to Dallas and I began reading the biographies that I had picked up along the way, I found myself sort of kind of making a list of my questions, because in the biographies, there are things that are unanswered. We don't know who his father was. We don't know where, like I said, we don't know where the last name came from. We don't know how he met his first or his second wife. There are so many things. And so I sort of accidentally started this laundry list of questions. And I did a lot of that for the first couple of years. But when we moved to the Low Country, I went to every history museum I could find. I walked the streets of Beaufort and Charleston. I went to the libraries. I talked to anyone who would tell me anything. And I had the extraordinary good fortune of talking with Small's great-great-grandson, who was living in Charleston at the time. He had actually come to Beaufort to lecture about his grandfather early on. And when I met him at Penn Center for that lecture, I was so insecure and starstruck that I didn't even tell him that I was trying to write a book about his great-great-grandfather. I just said, I'm really intrigued by this man. And later on, we had some really wonderful conversations. He read the early manuscript, gave me some great feedback. A local historian, Larry Rowland, Dr. Lawrence Rowland, who has written an extensive account of the history of the Beaufort area, big 3-volume like encyclopedia. He was a great resource, and he helped me with some of the details of the manuscript. But I also had, apart from the history, I had a lot to research and learn about the geography, the tides, the water. I grew up in a desert, so I didn't know how the tides worked, which is a very important part of the story. The rhythm of the tides in the Low Country is part of the story. I didn't know what bloomed when. I didn't know what kind of birds he was watching or what kind of fish he was catching out of the river. I had to kind of learn everything. And I think actually that because I was so unfamiliar with that it was probably helpful, because I was just soaking everything up. I had questions about absolutely everything.
Wow. And did you find a librarian, for example, that was
Oh, yes.
especially helpful? Or
Yes. The Beaufort County Library has a kind of a historical archives room and collection upstairs. And they're great. And honestly, librarians are just the best people in the world. And they will dig and hunt and borrow and, find all sorts of things. So that was
it's actually my honor. I serve as the vice chair of the Beaufort County Library Board.
Bless you. Thank you.
So I'm familiar, because of my involvement on the board of directors for the last couple of years. I've had an opportunity to get familiar with the library, the archives that you're talking about at Beaufort County Library. And for any of those of you who are interested in further exploring, our librarians love people like Rebecca Bruff, who come in and are full of questions, because they love the archives and delight in sharing them with others. Don't you find?
Absolutely. And they know how to dig, and there were times when I didn't know exactly what my next question was. I just knew it was there. And, when you get intrigued with something and it kind of takes you down a rabbit trail, and then that leads into like 9 more rabbit trails, and you're just chasing all these questions, and they were tremendous help. Really, really fabulous resources.
Now, we have a question from one of our audience members, Eileen. She wants to know, do you know any details about the movie coming out?
I get that question a lot. And whenever I talk with groups about this story, someone says, that would be a great movie, and it would be. So what I have been told by someone who I think really knows, Amazon optioned one of the biographies. There's a biography called Be Free or Die by Kate Lineberry. And Amazon optioned that. From what I've been told, they have shelved that project and it's not currently in production. I've also been told that another film service is considering picking it up somewhere along the way. My book has not been optioned. I would love to see that happen. It was made into a stage play. I don't know if we talked about that or if Robin and I talked about that. So the gentleman who narrated the audiobook is extraordinary. He's the perfect voice. He's a voice and stage actor in LA. He did a beautiful job with the audio, and he was just finishing that up in early summer of 2020. And the theater group that he worked with had to close because of COVID. And the creative director, a woman named Ellen Gear, who's the daughter of Will Gear, who people probably remember from the Waltons, Grandpa Walton. Ellen Gear runs that theater company and is the creative director. And she told Gerald, the narrator, that when they got back on the stage after COVID, she wanted to do some stories about important African Americans. And she asked him to bring her some ideas, and he did, and the book was one of those. And so it ran in their summer repertory season last year in a beautiful theater just outside of LA. And it was stunning. It was very powerful, very evocative and beautifully done. And it, it exposed the Robert Smalls story on the West Coast, where virtually no one had heard the name or the story before.
Any plans to bring that here with a group here doing the production, like Lean Ensemble or?
There have been some conversations about that, and that's a world that I know very little about. But Ms. Gear has made some connections with folks in Charleston and other places, and so we hope that might happen in the future.
That would be great.
Lovely, and it would be full circle for him to come back. The Dock Street Theater in Charleston is on the original site of the Planters Hotel, and so to return to that stage would truly be full circle and very exciting.
Well, you heard us say earlier, Rebecca, that Mitchellville, they're producing an original production of about Mitchellville, which was really about Hilton Head Island during the Civil War. But Lean Ensemble and some of the other local groups love to do original productions. So we should get your agent working on us.
We will see if we can make
promoting it to them. Yeah. And we have some connections with Mila Lerner, who chairs the board and is a member of WAHI. So we'll put a pitch in for you.
Let's try that. Let's do that.
Yeah. And so tell us a little bit about your writing process. While you were writing the book, did you write like every day or every afternoon, or put it away?
I wrote every day. I was just consumed by this project, and it was such a gift to be able to really focus on that, because I wasn't going to the office or to the church or to the hospital to visit people. I was going to the room downstairs to write. I wrote every morning for several hours, and then I found, usually I sort of discovered this rhythm, but I would write a scene or an idea or a conversation between characters and kind of get to my next sort of juncture of question and realize I needed to go do more research. And so the afternoons were usually some kind of research, either reading or walking downtown or going to the library or whatever it took at that point. And then I would sort of scheme and outline what the next day might look like. So I was given, Smalls himself gave me the outline of the story. His life was the outline. So I didn't have to create a plot, which was a wonderful gift, to be able to just dive in to a story that already existed. But I had a lot to learn about dialogue, about what we say in the writing world, show, don't tell, and really creating a picture with words. So I happened to have the good fortune of taking some of the workshops that the Conroy Center was offering at the time.
Yes.
Which was great. And they're still offering really tremendous opportunities for writers or aspiring writers and poets of all kinds. I also, part of my learning process was reading other good historical fiction, and reading both for the way the story was told. I discovered that the way I read was changing a little bit, because instead of just reading for the story, I was trying to see, how'd they do that? How did this author tell the story? And so I learned to do some of that. And I also learned a lot from reading the author's notes in good historical fiction.
Oh, did you?
That was really helpful to me. Sue Monk Kidd's book, Invention of Wings. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that. She does a beautiful job in the author's notes of describing her own research, but also things like where she might have sort of tweaked a timeline to make the storyline come together, that sort of thing. Same thing with Paula McLean's books. She does a really nice job of that. So that was very helpful. And in my own author's notes, I love that's a way to tell the reader, here's where the research stopped and I needed to invent a character to be the antagonist, that sort of thing.
Yes.
So reading other people's work was extraordinarily helpful.
Those are both very popular authors to model yourself after.
They're wonderful. They're wonderful authors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are you working on now?
Well, I ended up taking a couple of years off for some family care issues. And so I kind of trying to kind of get my traction back a little bit now. I am going to be collaborating with another author on a middle grade version of the Robert Smalls story.
Oh, are you?
It's kind of premature to even say that because we're just at the very beginning, but we really feel like it's important for young readers to have access to this story. I may be doing some type of a memoir, kind of the story of my late husband. And then there's another giant family saga that has just grabbed my attention, and I'm doing some research. It's definitely too early to make any pronouncements on that, but I look forward to kind of seeing where it goes.
We always like to hear what's next, and some authors want to talk about it and other people are not ready to talk.
I think after I really know where I'm going with some of these, I'll be eager to talk about it. But right now it's kind of when you think maybe about planting a garden or designing a room in a house, you kind of have these vague ideas, but you really can't see it. And that's kind of where these early ones are right now.
Well, I think one of the things that we've appreciated from all the authors we've talked to who've been just magical to talk with is how much patience is required for the writer and for the spouse.
Yes. Yes.
Because we've talked to lots of writers who said they thought they would be done in a year, and 5 years later, and you think, well, that's amazing. They have the grit and stick-to-itiveness, but the spouse too,
the family has to listen to a lot. I was really fortunate, as soon as we moved to Beaufort, I was able to finish a manuscript inside of a year, and it had been percolating for a while, but the real work happened really within about a year. But yeah, the rest of the family hears a lot of detail that's probably way beyond what they want to hear about.
And then did you get an agent at that time?
I had the good fortune of being introduced to a wonderful agent early on. She was Pat Conroy's agent, Cassandra King's agent.
Oh, yes.
Marley Rusoff. She was very familiar with the Robert Smalls story. And when we were introduced and someone told her that I was working on that, her response was, "Oh, I love that story. And I've always wanted someone to write it." So she just championed the story from the begining.
Wow.
And then of course we ran into some real challenges with publication. There was a number of publishers who really loved the story and loved the writing, but were not comfortable with the risk of a white woman writing a Black man's story. And which is a legitimate concern. And so I got some beautiful rejections early on.
Wow. Well, when we interviewed Marie Benedict about Personal Librarian, she said she didn't feel comfortable writing about what it was like to be a Black woman in the 1920s, passing for white. And so she went in search of a Black author and got hooked up with Victoria Murray. And that was the first time she'd really co-written a book. And their interview was fabulous to hear the dynamics of what they learned, particularly as they were writing the book in the midst of, George Floyd.
Yes.
So all those circumstances are different. So
right. The middle grade Smalls book is going to be in collaboration with a Black gentleman author who is fabulous. And we've already talked about how important it is for us to be able to do that well, and also to model that well,
Yes.
Really listen well to one another as we learn these stories.
Well, I can't thank you enough, first of all, to bringing this story to light, because I think it will be educational for anyone who reads it. And we look forward to hearing great things from you. And I want to figure out a way to help you get a production of the play done here. We got to work on that. Robin has.
I have an idea. And when you mentioned Dock Street and Spoleto, that would be a fabulous. Spoleto is the big arts festival in Charleston that happens at the end of May every year. We need to plant the seed to have this debut of this production, you know, in the next year or so. I don't have any connections with Spoleto, although I did when I worked for ETV years and years and years ago. But Rebecca, that would be so, I know Lean Ensemble.
It'd be exciting, wouldn't
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
it? It would
I-
be.
So this is where we want to hear from any of our members. If you have connections, write to Robin Zimmerman, write to Janet Porter. We'll take this charge on for you, Rebecca. Thank you
Thank you.
so
I
much.
appreciate
And Robin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you,
Absolute pleasure to be with you all. Thanks so much.
Rebecca. You are just, I love you. I love you so
good to
much.
see you.
I
Thank you.
just want you to know, this has been, I've been looking at the participation on this author series, Janet. You have knocked it out of the park. We have had more women with us on this author series than we've had for many of our authors. So
Oh my
you are
goodness.
beloved in this area.
Thank
Your
you. For
story-
those who have read, I appreciate it. I appreciate people that are sharing the story and sharing the book and, you know, and sharing the appreciation for this man. I
Well,
really do.
you are a treasure. We thank you, as Janet said, we thank you so, so much. And just kudos to you, dear one.
Thank you. Great to be with y'all. Thanks for the
Bye,
opportunity.
Rebecca.
Very grateful. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. And thank you, ladies, for being part of this author series. It's our 28th. It is such a joy to work with Janet Porter and this is pretty cool that we have these best-selling authors every other month. And Bobby does such a great job. Bobby Helbig and Nancy, we've got a great team. Our next one will actually be on May the 11th. And the author is Pamela Terry. She is a best-selling author, and her book is called When the Moon Turns Blue. That will be on May the 11th. So please join us for that. That'll be our 29th. We're moving into our 30th. We've been doing this all through COVID, and it has been such a joy to bring to you the Women's Association of Hilton Head Islands author series. Thank you, ladies. Have a wonderful weekend. Happy St. Patrick's Day. We have the parade coming up on Sunday, and please enjoy, and God bless you. Bye, everyone.